Time for another Marvel Snap over the air update. For those not familiar, these are the twice monthly updates where the secondary team adjusts the numbers on cards in the game. They can adjust cost, they can adjust power, and they can adjust numbers inside of the text box of the cards themselves. This week's over there update is the biggest Marvel Snap has ever seen, both in terms of the raw number of the cards being impacted. There are 8 card changes this week, as well as the impact that these changes are likely to have on the metagame, in my opinion. Let's go ahead and dive into it. Our first change is the big one. Elsa is keeping her 2/2 stat line, but she will now only give +2 power to a card when it fills lane while she's in play. I'm going to be completely honest. When I read these over the air update details, I was relieved to see this change in there. I was a little bit apprehensive that they might try and get away with shaving 1 or even 2 points of power off of Elsa's own stat line and not tackling the core of the problem, which is the constant buff that she can give again and again and again, either to cards moving out of her path like Vision and Jeff, or something like Kitty Pryde bouncing in and out constantly. That being said, this Elsa update is still an incredibly powerful card. While anything can happen and things are difficult to predict, I'd honestly be surprised if Elsa is still not a top 2 drop in the game. Just thinking about it from a raw stats perspective, if you trigger Elsa even a single time, she is a 2/4, which is solidly on rate for a 2 energy player, even a little bit above. If you trigger her 2 or 3 times, she's getting up to 6 or even 8 stats, and some of these decks can trigger her more than 3 or 4 times over the course of the game, meaning she can still threaten to get up into double digits worth of points for a 2 energy play. Second Dinner even acknowledges this fact, saying that they still want Elsa to shine while it's her season, but pulling her down like they are will hopefully provide a little bit more balance to the playfield, and I agree with that. I'm happy that they're starting here with 2, and if she continues to be a problem, I'm sure we'll see another adjustment in a future over-the-air update before long. Our next over there update this week is another adjustment to a recent season pass card. Loki is going from a 3/5 to a 4/5 while retaining his same text box. Something that's really interesting about Secondar's justification of this change is that they note while Loki has had pretty powerful performances at the very top of the ladder, in the more middling and lower tiers, Loki actually had a pretty average performance stats because it's a card that really requires you to leverage your play skill well, and that's reflective of my experience. One of the key things when utilizing Loki is figuring out, one, when you shouldn't be Lokiing because copying your opponent's deck isn't necessarily always good, and two, in the games where it is right to Loki proactively, figuring out exactly how you're going to sequence and play out cards that didn't start in your deck can often be challenging. Secondary notes that this change took them a little bit longer to make than something like the Elsa change that we're seeing more quickly, because there were a lot of different Loki decks in the metagame, and they wanted to see how things adjusted and see which parts of the card were proving to be most powerful. They make the noteworthy observation that Loki was largely just being used as a stat stick, especially alongside cards like Collector, which is why they had initially shaved 2 points of power off a Collector to try and remove some stats from that package in the meantime. And they're hoping that with Loki at a 5 energy play, he won't just be a pile of stats that you play to the board, since there's potentially better 4 energy cards that let you do that, but instead will provide you with an interesting choice of, is it good to copy my opponent's deck into my hand at a reduced cost? If yes, then play Loki. Speaking of that recent change to Collector, our next update in today's OTA is a rollback of that. Collector is going from a 2/0 back to a 2/2, with Second Dinner noting that the initial goal of nerfing Collector was to just take some points of power out of Loki's package while they were figuring out exactly where he wanted to end up at. And now that they've arrived at what's likely a more permanent change for Loki, with him going to a 4 cost, Collector can get back some of his initial stats. I'm happy to see this happen, because I think when Collector was downgraded to that base 0 power, he was really struggling outside of the Loki decks, and while I don't think any of those decks will suddenly become top tier with Collector gaining the stats back, any points you can put back into those B tier and below decks is a win for the people that enjoy playing them. Our next update this week is a nerf to one of the most commonly played cards in the game, and that is Angela. She's going from a 2/0 that gets +2 power when a card is played to her path to a 2/2 that gets +1 when a card is played to her path. At face value, if you play Angela in a super honest manner, playing 3 cards out to her lane, this means she's going to end up as a 2/5 as opposed to a 2/6. Obviously, the core power of Angela as a card is that you typically don't play her in that very direct manner. You're playing things like Kitty Pryde or Spider-Man or Jeff that move out of her path, letting you trigger her way more than 3 times over the course of the game, meaning cutting that bonus that she's getting from those triggers in half is a pretty sizable reduction. Second Dinner notes that this change to Angela is something that they've kind of been skirting around for a little while, but most recently with the addition of Elsa to the metagame, Angela was actually in 4 of the top 5 performing decks in their stats, and they're just going to go ahead and kind of cut her down to size and see where things land. Second Dinner notes that they're honestly not sure how far the reverberations of this Angela change are going to have across the metagame since she's in so many different decks. So in other changes, they often try to proactively buff something up when they take power out of one place in a deck, i.e. the collector buff above to complement the Loki nerf, but Angela is going to impact so many things. They just want to kind of see where things land before they potentially make adjustments to any decks that were previously playing Angela. Our next nerf this week is a small one. All things considered, Sauron is going from a 3/3 down to a 3/2. Secondary notes that this change might be surprising to some folks on the outside, but Sauron has quietly been one of the top performing cards in Marvel Stat basically since his release, almost always being a top 10 card and frequently crossing the line into being a top 5 card in the game. That being said, part of the reason why it's consistently such a strong card is Sauron basically only sees play in one shell, i.e. the Shuri Red Skull Taskmaster deck, and that deck is consistently very powerful. We saw Second Dinner take some of off the top of this deck in the most recent over their update before this one, taking Shuri from a 4/2 down to a 4/1. Similarly, this change to Sauron is just a very small shave off the top, and I honestly don't expect it to make that much of a change from a gameplay impact in a lot of situations when you're dealing with, 20s and 30s like Shuri into Red Skull is often putting out. 1 point isn't often the make or break difference, but sometimes it can be. In general, even if this change isn't going to be super impactful, I think taking a point of power away from something that's a top deck to make it a little bit more attackable in niche situations is worthwhile to do, and this one seems fine for that reason. Our next update this week is a buff to an underplayed card that definitely needed it, and that is Hellcow going from a 4/6 who discards 2 cards from your hand to a 4/8. A little bit of fun history on Hellcow is that during the closed beta, Hellcow was absolutely a powerhouse, and that's because it was a 2/6 with this same text box. Obviously, being a 2/6, that meant it saw play outside of discard decks. It's just like this big finisher you played on the last turn or something that you zeroed out for good stat lines. And I always thought it was kind of strange that when they inevitably moved Hellcow from being a 2 cost to being a 4 cost, they didn't adjust its power to compensate at all. Second Dinner notes that overall, their adjustments to the discard cards has been very successful, and there's a variety of discard decks seeing play. That being said, Hellcow has been one of the worst performing discard cards in all of those, so they're giving it a little bit of love. They also note that Hellcow serves a very different role than things like Silver Samurai, which targets a very specific type of card. Hellcow prioritizes just discarding things in bulk, which is a very specific type of thing that not every discard deck wants to be doing. Our next buff is one that I'm not too surprised to see with the Marvels releasing just around the corner. Spectrum is going from a 6/5 that gives all of your ongoing cards +2 power to a 6/7. Whenever I try and think about a card like Spectrum, I always try and put it in terms of, okay, how many points of this power bonus do I need to get out of this card for her to be on or above rate compared to other 6 energy plays that I could be making? Her base power going up to 7 means that if I'm buffing just 3 other ongoing cards, she's going to be providing 13 stats to the board, which generally speaking is a little bit above rate from what I'd expect from a 6 energy card like Magneto or the Hulk. Overall, I think this is one of those kind of free upgrades. I don't know that I expect ongoing cards to dominate the metagame with Spectrum getting this small bonus, but in tandem with Elsa and Angela making the decks that put power on the board early, early, getting a little bit smaller. This little bit extra on top for Spectrum could move the needle on her being a competitively viable deck, especially in a post-Man-Thing world. Our last update's a tiny one. We have Uetu going from a 1-1 up to a 1-2. Second Dinner notes that they said if their redesigned Uetu was still floundering as a 1-1, they'd put his extra stat back, and glad to see that happen. I don't know that he becomes playable as a 1-2 that shows you the rightmost location just by being in your deck, but it certainly can't hurt, so have your stat back, Uetu. As someone who spent the better part of the last week repeating on stream, if they don't adjust Elsa's text box in the OTA, it's going to be an incredible miss. I am so glad that Elsa is getting changed. I think the Angela change on top of that is a welcome addition as well. Hopefully this will give some breathing room to a variety of other 1 and 2 energy cards to be playable at the bottom end of the curve. I know as someone who spent a lot of time brewing decks, especially around Niku Minara recently, it felt like every deck just ended up being an Angela, Elsa, Jeff mush, because those are just the most efficient things to be doing by a lot. I'm hopeful that with these 2 changes to these other cheaper cards, things like Lizard and Silk and others can open up a little bit at the bottom end of the curve as reasonable choices. I'd love to know what you're interested in playing and what you think these changes are going to do to the metagame in the comments down below. And as always, be sure to check back in again tomorrow when we'll have a fresh deck highlight exploring this new format with all these changes. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.